Welcome back to Live Now from Fox. I'm Shauna Kalafi. A big update on a case that's been getting a lot of attention out of Ohio after a popular Netflix documentary was released detailing this case. The Ohio Supreme Court has now declined to hear the appeal for McKenzie Sharilla. She's currently serving 15 years to life for intentionally crashing her car into a building at high speeds, killing her two passengers.
McKenzie Sharilla is fighting for another chance. Just weeks after Ohio's highest court declined to review her latest legal challenge, McKenzie's attorneys are back. On July 7, 2026, they asked the Ohio Supreme Court to reconsider. Their argument? The deadlines surrounding McKenzie's post-conviction case were confusing and inconsistent. But there is one problem. The petition at the center of this legal battle was filed late, not by a month, not by a week, by one day, one single day. And according to McKenzie's legal team, a calendar mistake involving a leap year may have cost her a critical opportunity to challenge her conviction. But while her attorneys fight over dates, deadlines, and another chance in court, a completely different record has been building behind prison walls. 36 conduct reports, 32 guilty findings, contraband, altered prison clothing, medication that was not prescribed to her, more than 100 video visits involving an unapproved visitor, and a separate explicit video call that resulted in McKenzie losing video visitation privileges for 60 days. This is the same young woman serving 15 years to life after a judge concluded that she deliberately accelerated her Toyota Camry to more than 90 miles per hour and drove directly into a brick building. Her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, was inside that car. So was their friend, DaVon Flanigan. Both young men died. McKenzie survived. And now, almost 4 years after that violent crash, the case that once appeared legally settled has exploded back into the headlines. Her supporters say she deserves another chance. Her legal team has raised questions about whether a medical condition could explain what happened behind the wheel. Her family continues to stand beside her, but prosecutors argued this was never a medical emergency. They said it was murder. And after watching the surveillance footage and hearing the evidence, Judge Nancy Russo delivered a conclusion that would follow McKenzie into prison. She had a mission, and she executed it with precision. So what really happened in those final seconds before the crash? Why did McKenzie's car accelerate instead of slow down? How did a one-day filing mistake become the center of her latest legal fight? And perhaps most importantly, what do McKenzie Sharilla's own prison records reveal about the woman now asking Ohio's highest court for another chance? Because away from the courtroom cameras, prison officials have been documenting a completely different chapter of this case. If you appreciate true crime documentaries that actually examine the records, subscribe to Midnight Crime Files. Now, back to McKenzie, because this is where her legal situation takes an unexpected turn. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why that record could become extremely important when McKenzie eventually sits before a parole board. And tonight, we're examining the crash, the evidence, the prison violations, and the new legal fight surrounding McKenzie Sharilla. But before we talk about McKenzie, we need to remember the two people who never got the opportunity to fight for another chance. Dominic Russo was 20 years old. DaVon Flanigan was 19. On the morning of July 31, 2022, both young men were passengers in McKenzie's Toyota Camry. Dominic was McKenzie's boyfriend. Their relationship had been described during the case as turbulent and complicated. DaVon was their friend. 3 young people entered that car. Only one of them would survive what happened next. It was early in the morning in Strongsville, Ohio. Most of the city was still quiet. McKenzie was 17 years old. She was behind the wheel. At some point, her Toyota Camry entered a business area near Progress Drive, and then the car began to accelerate. This is where the case becomes difficult to explain as a simple traffic accident, because investigators didn't have to rely only on memory. McKenzie said she could not remember the crash. Dominic and DaVon could no longer explain what happened. But the car itself had recorded data, and surveillance cameras had captured its movement. Investigators examined the Toyota's event data recorder, the system commonly described as a vehicle's black box. The numbers were devastating. The car reached a speed of approximately 92 miles per hour. The accelerator was pushed completely down. The prosecution said the throttle remained at 100% for several seconds before impact. And there was another detail. The brakes were not applied. Think about that sequence. A car moving through an area where the speed limit was far lower. The speed climbing. The accelerator pressed to the floor. The vehicle continuing forward. No meaningful braking before impact. And then, the Toyota slammed into a brick building. The collision was catastrophic. When emergency responders arrived, the 3 occupants were trapped inside the badly damaged vehicle. Dominic Russo was pronounced dead. DaVon Flanigan was pronounced dead. McKenzie Sharilla was still alive. She had survived a crash that killed both of her passengers. And almost immediately, investigators were faced with a question. Was this a horrific accident, or had Mackenzie driven into that building intentionally? That question would eventually divide people across the country. And even today, there are people who believe the court got the answer wrong. Mackenzie's position has remained that she did not intentionally kill Dominic and DaVon. She said she could not remember the crash. Her defense argued there could be a medical explanation for what happened. The possibility of losing consciousness became a major part of the arguments surrounding her case. If Mackenzie had blacked out behind the wheel, the entire interpretation of the crash could change. A driver who loses consciousness cannot deliberately choose a target. A driver experiencing a genuine medical emergency may keep a foot pressed against a pedal without understanding what is happening. And if Mackenzie truly had no conscious control of the vehicle, then the prosecution's theory of intentional murder would face a serious problem. But prosecutors believed the evidence told a different story. They focused heavily on the movement of the car, the route, the acceleration, the surveillance footage, and the vehicle data. The Toyota did not simply drift randomly off the road. The state argued that the car's movement showed control. According to the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence, Mackenzie navigated the vehicle before the final impact. The car accelerated dramatically, and instead of braking or making an obvious attempt to avoid the building, it continued toward the wall. For prosecutors, the black box data wasn't simply a collection of numbers. It was a timeline, a mechanical witness. And it told them that in the final seconds of Dominic and DaVon's lives, the Toyota was being pushed harder and harder. The defense saw uncertainty. The prosecution saw intent. And because Mackenzie chose a bench trial, there would be no jury deciding between those two interpretations. One judge would determine whether this was an accident or murder. Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Russo. In August 2023, Judge Russo announced her verdict. And her words were direct. This was not reckless driving. This was murder. McKenzie Sharilla was found guilty. 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide. There were also convictions connected to drugs and criminal tools, but it was the murder convictions that defined the case. Judge Russo described the surveillance video as chilling. She said Mackenzie had transformed from a responsible driver into what she called literal hell on wheels. The judge focused on the route Mackenzie chose, the early hour, the speed, the acceleration, and the final approach toward the building. In Judge Russo's view, these were not random events, they were decisions. And then came the statement that would become one of the most repeated lines from the entire case. Mackenzie had a mission, and she executed it with precision. For Dominic and DaVon's families, the verdict answered the legal question. The court had ruled that their sons were murdered, but sentencing presented another painful decision. Should Mackenzie serve separate life sentences for each young man, or should the sentences run at the same time? The families asked the court to recognize that 2 lives had been taken, 2 sons, 2 futures, 2 empty spaces at family gatherings. Mackenzie also spoke. She apologized to Dominic and DaVon's families. She said she was deeply sorry. She said she never wanted this to happen. She maintained that she did not do it intentionally, and she described Dominic as her soulmate. The court ultimately sentenced Mackenzie to 15 years to life on the murder counts, with the sentences running concurrently. That meant she would serve a minimum period before becoming eligible for parole. But parole eligibility is not the same as release. It is an opportunity to ask. And Judge Russo made it clear at sentencing that Mackenzie's future was far from guaranteed. The judge said there was a very good likelihood Mackenzie could spend the rest of her life in prison. At 18 years old, McKenzie Sharilla entered a completely different world. The courtroom cameras disappeared. The headlines slowed down. The trial was over. The prison sentence had begun. And this is where the story should have become quiet. But it didn't, because prison officials began keeping their own record. And nearly 3 years into Mackenzie's incarceration, that record now includes 36 conduct reports. According to disciplinary records obtained and reported by local media, Mackenzie was found guilty in 32 cases. 3 resulted in not guilty findings, and 1 disposition was not listed in the reporting. Now, numbers alone can be misleading. 36 conduct reports sounds dramatic, but to understand what that means, you have to look at what prison officials actually documented. Mackenzie entered the Ohio Reformatory for Women in August 2023. For months, according to the reported disciplinary timeline, she went without a conduct report. Then, in May 2024, the violations began. One of the early issues involved Mackenzie being out of place. Inside a correctional facility, location is controlled. Where an inmate is supposed to be is not treated like a suggestion. Prison officials conduct counts to account for the people in their custody. Movement is restricted. Schedules are enforced. An inmate who repeatedly appears somewhere she is not authorized to be can create problems for staff responsible for knowing where every prisoner is located. But the reports didn't stop there. By September 2024, prison officials documented a much larger contraband case. During a search of Mackenzie's belongings, staff reportedly discovered 29 bottles of paint, craft supplies, jewelry-making materials, and notes listing prices for homemade jewelry. On the outside, paint and jewelry charms might sound harmless. Inside prison, the question is not whether an item looks dangerous to the average person. The question is whether the inmate is authorized to possess it. Prisons control property for security reasons. Items can be traded. They can become part of an underground economy. Possessions can create debts and disputes. And according to the records, Mackenzie was charged in connection with contraband and stealing. Then came another search. In October 2024, staff reportedly found altered clothing, another inmate's fan, and nude magazine images. Again, the details may seem strange to someone unfamiliar with prison rules. Why would altered clothing matter? Why would a fan matter? Because prison is built around control. Clothing is issued. Property is assigned. Items belonging to another inmate raise questions about trading, borrowing, pressure, or unauthorized exchanges. The prison does not necessarily have to prove an elaborate criminal operation every time an inmate possesses something she should not have. Unauthorized property itself can be enough for disciplinary action, and Mackenzie's file continued to grow. But in January 2025, staff documented something more serious: medication. According to hearing paperwork described in reporting on Mackenzie's prison records, officers found pills that were not prescribed to her. The records also referenced a personal photograph that staff described as containing drug use. Mackenzie disputed part of the allegation. She reportedly told staff the image did not show drug use, and she said the pills were prenatal vitamins she had received from someone else. But there was still an obvious problem. The medication was not prescribed to Mackenzie, and she admitted, according to the hearing paperwork, that she had received the pills from another person. In prison, medication is tightly controlled. There is a reason for that. A pill moving from one inmate to another creates a safety risk. Staff may not know what was exchanged. They may not know why. They may not know whether pressure, payment, or another arrangement was involved. And even if an inmate believes a pill is harmless, unauthorized medication can still violate institutional rules. By this point, Mackenzie's prison record was no longer about one isolated mistake. There was a pattern developing. Being out of place, contraband, altered clothing, property issues, medication not prescribed to her. But the violation that would generate some of the biggest headlines involved Mackenzie's connection to the outside world: video visits. For someone serving 15 years to life, a video call can become incredibly important. The world outside prison keeps moving. Friends change, families age, birthdays happen, holidays pass. A person in prison experiences all of that from a distance. Video visits offer a small window into the world an inmate has lost, but that access comes with rules. And according to an April 2025 conduct report, Mackenzie had participated in more than 100 video visits with a person who was not approved to visit her. The report stated that another name had been used, and the visitor was described as a released former inmate. More than 100 video visits, not one accidental connection, not one misunderstanding. According to the disciplinary record, this had happened repeatedly. Mackenzie pleaded guilty to the violation. The punishment was a 30-day electronics restriction. But months later, video visitation would place Mackenzie back in trouble, and this time, the details were much more explicit. A September 2025 conduct report described 7 video visits between Mackenzie and another visitor. During one of those calls, prison staff said Mackenzie exposed her breast. The report also described the visitor displaying an adult toy on camera and later appearing completely undressed. Mackenzie pleaded guilty. A hearing officer imposed a 60-day video visiting restriction. For 2 months, one of Mackenzie's connections to the outside world was taken away, and when those records became public, reaction online was immediate. Some people saw the disciplinary reports as evidence that Mackenzie had not changed. They connected her behavior in prison to the same disregard for consequences prosecutors described at trial. Their argument was simple. Mackenzie is serving 15 years to life. She knows prison calls are monitored. She knows the facility has rules. And yet she continues to make decisions that result in formal disciplinary action. But there is another side to the debate. Some of Mackenzie's supporters believe the public is using ordinary prison misconduct to reinforce a conclusion they already reached about her character. They argue that Mackenzie entered prison as a teenager, that she is now living under extreme restrictions, and that prison conduct reports should not automatically be treated as evidence about what happened on July 31, 2022. And on that narrow point, there is an important distinction. A prison violation does not prove Mackenzie intentionally crashed the car. The murder conviction was based on evidence presented at trial. The surveillance footage, the vehicle data, the circumstances surrounding the crash. The disciplinary reports came later and not. They are a separate record. But that does not mean they are meaningless, because Mackenzie's future could eventually depend on whether authorities believe she has changed. And every time a new violation enters her prison file, it becomes another documented part of her life behind bars. That is what makes these records so important. Not because paint proves murder, not because an explicit video call explains a deadly crash, but because Mackenzie is serving a life sentence with the possibility of parole. One day, she may have to convince a parole board that she is ready to live outside prison, and the board will have more than her trial record to consider. They will be able to examine her conduct while incarcerated, her programming, her institutional adjustment, her disciplinary history, and potentially whether her behavior demonstrates growth. Right now, the public record raises difficult questions. 36 conduct reports, 32 guilty findings. That is the record being discussed while Mackenzie's legal team fights to reopen another path in court. And that legal battle has become almost as controversial as the original case. Because Mackenzie's latest post-conviction fight did not fail after a judge listened to hours of new medical testimony and rejected it. The petition was dismissed as untimely. The filing deadline was 365 days. Mackenzie's petition was filed on day 366. 1 day late, her attorneys said a calendar mistake was involved. The year 2024 was a leap year. February had 29 days. And according to the legal arguments surrounding the case, that extra day became extremely important. Imagine working on a case involving a young woman serving 15 years to life. Imagine preparing arguments that her original legal representation failed her. Imagine attempting to present additional medical evidence connected to the possibility that she blacked out. And then imagine being told the court cannot consider the petition because the paperwork arrived 1 day after the statutory deadline. That is essentially the legal nightmare now surrounding Mackenzie's case. But the appellate court's March 2026 decision was clear. Ohio law provides a 365-day deadline for a post-conviction petition under the circumstances described in the case. The court found that Mackenzie's petition was filed on the 366th day after the trial transcript was filed, and unless specific statutory exceptions applied, the trial court did not have jurisdiction to consider the late petition. Mackenzie's legal team argued about the deadline calculation. They raised fairness concerns, but the appeals court concluded the legal exceptions had not been satisfied. In simple terms, the court said it did not have the authority to simply forgive the one-day delay. The judgment was affirmed. Mackenzie's lawyers then asked the Ohio Supreme Court to review the matter. On June 23, 2026, the state's highest court declined to accept the appeal. For many people following the case, that sounded final. Another legal challenge had failed. Another door appeared to close. But then came July 7th. Mackenzie's attorneys filed a motion asking the Ohio Supreme Court to reconsider. They argued that Mackenzie had faced confusing and inconsistent deadlines. The legal fight was alive again, at least for the moment. And this is where we need to be very careful with the word appeal, because Mackenzie's case has moved through different legal challenges. Her direct appeal was already considered. In September 2024, Ohio's 8th District Court of Appeals affirmed her convictions. That court examined arguments attacking the evidence and the trial. The convictions remained in place. The later one-day deadline dispute involves a post-conviction relief petition. That distinction matters. It would be inaccurate to say that every challenge Mackenzie has made was rejected only because someone forgot about a leap year. Her direct appeal was decided separately. The missed deadline became central to a later post-conviction challenge. And in that later petition, Mackenzie's legal team wanted the court to consider claims involving ineffective assistance and additional medical evidence. The medical issue is one of the reasons Mackenzie's supporters remain convinced she deserves another trial. They believe the possibility of a blackout was never presented as effectively as it should have been. They question whether Mackenzie's original defense did enough. And they argue that when a teenager is sentenced to life with parole eligibility after 15 years, the courts should examine serious medical claims on their merits, rather than allowing one day to end the discussion. But prosecutors and people who believe the conviction is correct point back to the evidence. The car data, the surveillance video, the acceleration, the lack of braking, the movement of the vehicle, and the trial judge's conclusion. They also point out that Mackenzie's convictions were upheld on direct appeal. This is why the case remains so divisive. One side sees a 17-year-old who may have suffered a medical episode and received ineffective legal representation. The other sees a convicted murderer whose guilt was established in court and whose conviction survived direct appellate review. And between those two sides are the families of Dominic Russo and DaVon Flanigan. Families who have already lived through a trial, a sentencing, appeals, documentaries, online debates, social media arguments, and now renewed headlines. Dominic was 20. DaVon was 19. It is easy for their names to disappear when the conversation becomes focused on Mackenzie's prison photographs, her conduct reports, or her attorney's filing deadline. But everything in this case begins with their deaths. Dominic and DaVon do not get another hearing. They do not get a reconsideration request. Their families do not get to correct a mistake and return to July 31, 2022. For them, the consequences of that morning are permanent. And regardless of where you stand on Mackenzie's legal arguments, that fact cannot be debated. 2 young men entered the car. 2 young men died. At sentencing, their loved ones spoke about the impact of those losses. The court heard the pain left behind. And now, years later, the public continues to dissect Mackenzie's every move. But for Dominic and DaVon's families, this is not a documentary mystery. It is their life. This is why responsible true crime coverage has to resist turning a case into a competition between Team Mackenzie and Team Prosecution. The evidence matters. The legal process matters. But the victims matter too. And there is one more question we need to examine. What happens if Mackenzie's latest legal effort fails? For now, Mackenzie remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Her 15 years to life sentence remains in place. Her convictions remain intact. And unless a court changes her legal situation, her future path toward freedom will eventually involve parole. That makes her prison record important. A parole hearing is not a second criminal trial. The board is not being asked to decide whether Mackenzie committed the murders all over again. She has already been convicted. Instead, the question becomes whether release is appropriate, and institutional conduct can become part of that discussion. This is where 32 guilty disciplinary findings could create a problem. A parole board looking at Mackenzie's file years from now could see her violations as evidence of poor adjustment to incarceration. But time also matters. Mackenzie is still years away from her first parole opportunity. If she spends the next decade without serious violations, completes available programs, follows institutional rules, and builds a record of change, the file reviewed in the future could look different from the file being discussed today. That is important. A disciplinary record is not frozen forever at 32 findings. Future behavior can add more violations, or future behavior can show a different pattern. The question is what Mackenzie does next, because prison officials have already documented what happened during her early years of incarceration: the unauthorized property, the medication, the video visitation violations, the explicit call. Those entries exist. Mackenzie cannot go back and erase them. She can only determine what the next pages of her prison record will say, and that may be the most interesting part of this entire new chapter. At 17, prosecutors said Mackenzie made a decision that lasted only seconds. A foot pressed against an accelerator, a car gaining speed, a brick wall approaching, and 2 lives ending. The court decided those seconds demonstrated intent. Now Mackenzie is living in a world where every year matters, every deadline matters. 1 extra day in a leap year mattered. 60 days without video visitation mattered. 30 days of electronics restriction mattered. And years from now, when she eventually asks for parole, the choices documented across more than a decade could matter. There is a cruel symmetry to that. This entire case has become a story about time, the final seconds before the crash, the years Dominic and DaVon should have had, the 15-year minimum Mackenzie must serve, and the single day her attorneys missed. 1 day. That is the argument now sitting at the center of Mackenzie's latest legal fight. Her lawyers want the Ohio Supreme Court to reconsider. They want another opportunity for the post-conviction issues to be heard. Whether the court agrees remains the question. But one thing is already clear. The case of McKenzie Sharilla is not disappearing. The release of new prison records has reopened public debate about her behavior. Her legal team continues to challenge the barriers surrounding her post-conviction claims. Her supporters continue to insist there is more to the crash than the prosecution's version. And the original evidence remains as disturbing today as it was in 2023. A 17-year-old driver, a Toyota Camry, a speed of more than 90 miles per hour, an accelerator pressed to the floor, no braking before impact, a brick building, and 2 young men who never came home. Dominic Russo, DaVon Flanigan. Those are the names at the center of this case. And whatever happens next in Mackenzie's legal fight, their loss is the part of this story no court can reconsider. But now I want to know what you think. Should Ohio's highest court reconsider McKenzie Sharilla's case because her post-conviction petition was filed only 1 day late? Or do you believe the evidence presented at trial and the direct appeal have already answered the most important questions? And what do you make of the 36 conduct reports now following Mackenzie through prison? Do they show someone struggling to adjust to a life sentence? Or do they raise deeper questions about accountability and her ability to follow rules even when the consequences are clear? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want true crime documentaries that go beyond the headline and examine the evidence, court records, and new developments, subscribe to Midnight Crime Files. Because this case is still developing, and if the Ohio Supreme Court responds to Mackenzie's latest request, we'll be following what happens next. Until then, remember Dominic Russo. Remember DaVon Flanigan, and thank you for watching Midnight Crime Files.